Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Physician Leadership Program. My name is Dr. Tom Cooper. I'm a faculty member in business administration, where I teach strategy, risk management, corporate social responsibility, management consulting, basically whatever they need me to teach. I've been a facilitator at the Gardner Center for the last 13 years, and I've been teaching on the Physician Leadership Program for probably the last 5, 6 years. I come from a long or a family of doctors, and I'm the black sheep who never went into it and became a business school professor. So I understand a little bit in terms of some of the challenges you face as physicians, and the 3 sessions we'll be doing over the next couple of weeks in terms of managing competing priorities and project management are all hopefully some skills that you can use as physicians to make yourselves better as leaders. And then secondly, in terms of helping your practices and helping your patients and helping a whole bunch of other stakeholders. So the format is that I'm going to go through some slides. There's an additional basically exercise book that you're going to work through on Brightspace. And then thirdly, we will get together on July the 9th, I believe, at a specific time, which should be shared with you. I believe it's at 12, maybe 1 o'clock. But anyway, that'll be on your Brightspace page and be told about that beforehand. So I'll just be talking through these slides, saying when and where you have to do the different exercises, and hopefully it'll be reasonably straightforward. Awesome. So off we go. So managing competing priorities, for all the physicians I've known and all the physicians I've taught, this has always been an element of I wouldn't say difficulty, of maybe challenge is a better word. Because obviously you're uber successful as physicians, and whether you're the whole range of the specialties and the areas of medicine that you've gone into, but ultimately you've gotten to this point of your career by being really good at doing a lot of different things. But ultimately, as leaders, we always have to consider what are our different priorities and what are the different things that we need to look at. And this is actually, just as an aside for me, this is the only course, I teach multiple sections of different courses at the Gardner Center. I may teach change management 5 or 6 times, etc. But I only teach managing competing priorities for the Physician Leadership Program. I used to teach it for some other organizations, but I found it was so compelling and so unique and contextually driven in terms of what physicians have to do in terms of managing competing priorities. I thought it was easier just to focus on what your profession has to do. So in terms of, and ultimately we like to say I try to take one day at a time, but sometimes several days attack me at once, which given that it's about 7:30 at night now while I'm doing this, yeah, it feels like that for me sometimes. And I'm sure speaking to the physicians in my family, the same sort of thing. So ultimately, we live in a world, and the research shows is that I was listening to a podcast from the current CEO of Goldman Sachs, and he was talking about what it was like back in the 80s and the 90s, which, given that I'm 50 years old this year, I can kind of remember. But, worked finished at 6. And my dad, who's a doctor, obviously is a physician, he would get called in, but it was really, he was a pediatrician, or he is a pediatrician, but he would get called in at night, and then he would, but it was the home phone. But there was no emails, there was memos, there was all that sort of thing. But this whole idea of being, either directly on call or ultimately being expected to be around and provide guidance and provide input as physicians and as leaders, and whether you're in medicine or healthcare or in the whole entire world, it's really, really hard to either shut off your mind or shut off your responsibilities or shut off all the activities that you're supposed to be involved in. So prioritizing and understanding what the both now and in the future is a challenge. And so ultimately, as physicians, you have to consider how do I start to manage those competing priorities. So in order to look at this, we're going to talk about a number of different things. We're going to talk about the underlying assumptions that underpin time management and underpin managing competing priorities. We'll talk about the language trap of the term time management. What does that mean? Can we really manage time? There'll be a worksheet that I'll refer to, and then we can go through that and work through that on your own time as well. Hopefully there'll be lots of tools, tips, and techniques that come through not only in terms of doing the worksheet, but also when we get together and we do our Zoom call. We'll talk a little bit about success in terms of how to think about success. We'll also talk about some specific things around how not to procrastinate, meeting management, delegation, micromanagement, etc. And then finally, you'll be working on an action plan in terms including review and timing as well. So some of the key assumptions that we have is that there's three primary factors that shape our ability to manage and competing priorities effectively: the environment or culture within we work. Number two, the current workload in terms of tasks, projects, assignments, goals, high priority interruptions, etc. And also our individual preferences in terms of our style, work style, tendencies, daily routine, etc. Let's break that down. Obviously, depending on the nature of the medical profession that you're in, the environment or culture within your work can be very, very high paced. It can be very intense. It can be very long hours, etc. That's going to be different than if you're, say, you're a provincial government employee and if you're at manager level or below, you're probably working, 8, 10 hours a day. If you're like me as a professor, it's kind of a 24/7 type of gig. But that's okay because I can walk out in the middle of the day and I can go for a walk if I want, which obviously as a physician, you can't leave your practice and walk out for an hour if you have people that need to see you. So the environment or culture which we work shapes our ability to manage competing priorities. And before I returned back to academia in 2007, I worked as a management consultant with PricewaterhouseCoopers, mostly in Europe. And what I found is that when I was working there, I had hours that had to be built, and those hours were very, very important. And if I didn't have any hours to build, well, then what was I doing there? And I could go do different things, etc. So my workload, and I guess this is the second point in terms of your current workload, wasn't just charging hours, but it was also in terms of tasks, projects, assignments, goals, high priority interruptions, etc. If you're like me, and I think most physicians, that ability to say no is a difficult thing. Uh, Learning how to say no and when to say no around tasks, projects, assignments, goals, high priority interruptions, etc., is because you've probably got successful at this point by not saying no, by saying yes, I'll do that, yes, and you create these opportunities which put you in a position to thrive and survive, or thrive and succeed, and ultimately then the problem then becomes how do you survive with all this stuff going on? So ultimately, the current workload is going to be one of the factors that shapes your ability to manage competing priorities. And then ultimately, as physicians, you have individual preferences. And as human beings, we have individual preferences. Some of you may be morning people, some of you may be afternoon people, and some of you may be evening people. But you have to look at the challenge in terms of what are the different ways, what are your individual preferences in terms of your work style, your daily activities, what you're trying to do, etc. So it's always going to be a challenge. See, that's my father calling me right now. There you go. In terms of how you look at your managing competing parties. And for me personally, I'm way more productive in the morning. Between about 1:30 and 3:30, 4 o'clock, I'm pretty useless. It's a good time for me to do meetings. I sit on a couple of regulatory boards and I'm always trying to get the meetings at that time because I'm still good in terms of meetings. I can think and I can give my opinion, but in terms of writing or getting anything where I have to really, really concentrate and think, it's not a great time. And then after about 7, my brain ramps up again until about I go to bed until about 10 o'clock. So ultimately, it's up to you as an individual. There's also some assumptions that we cannot increase the numbers of hours in a day. We can't increase the numbers of hours in a day because there's only 24 hours in a day. It's too bad. Um, Ultimately, we've seen with COVID-19 is that they're trying to drag a whole bunch of different hours out of us. But we cannot increase the amount of hours in a day. But to a certain extent, we can increase the amount of energy we have to spend. And by the time we have to spend, that means what are the different things that we can do to increase the energy that we have at specific points in time so that we can make it more successful. And then to a greater degree, we can choose how we allocate our attention as well. Are we always concentrating? Are we always in the moment? Are we always looking at what we should be doing? Or instead is our brain here, there, everywhere? And this is one of the difficult things with physicians is that you're, for the 99% of you are incredibly clever and way clever than your average person. So that means that ultimately you're getting thrown a lot of things at you because, hey, you can handle it. But that ability to concentrate, that ability to attention is something that's diminishing in society. And moreover, it's diminishing with physicians as well. And that's normal. If you got 20 different things going on at one time in your head, that ability to focus and concentrate, etc., is really challenged. I remember the first time I did this with physicians, we talked about some of the different strategies we can use, like, for example, meditation, which I picked up and I do when I'm pretty stressed, but I do have a meditation app on my phone. Yoga, which once again is something I do. I've been doing it since the pandemic for a bunch of different reasons, but it's something once again that helps me try and focus and be in the moment. And it's actually personally for me is that when I'm teaching, is that I'm very concentrated. I'm in the moment. When I'm writing is a little bit more of a difficult challenge, depending if I have a deadline, etc. But that degree which we choose how to allocate our attention as physician for you as physicians and as leaders is really an important choice. So ultimately, I have to ask questions. Why do we waste time and when do we best utilize our time? And what do we mean by time wasting? Is it time spent on social media? Is it time spent in the gym? Is it time spent on uh, gossiping, all that sort of thing? Now, people would argue, no, social media is really important. I need to know what's going on in the world, and I need to exercise for my health. And gossiping helps me with networking and finding all the things going on, etc. So that concept of utilization or wastage is going to be different for individuals and in terms of how they look at their time. It's also culturally different. I do a lot of work in indigenous, or I have done a lot of work in indigenous communities. And, if you organize a meeting and start at 9, most people kind of roll in around 9:30, 9:45, may get started at 10. If it's supposed to go throughout lunch, that doesn't happen. People break for lunch, may come back around 1, 2 o'clock, and then you're usually finished by 4. That's a different culture than when I worked in London and New York, where people would be at their desk for 7:30 and they'd leave around 6:30, 7 o'clock at night, depending on the organization. And that ties into the third thing in terms of companies and organizations, in terms of how they see time. Now, ultimately, what the books, and there's tons of books written about time management and managing competing priorities, but the focus is on being efficient and effective given the goals of the organization, division, project, etc. So one of the things is that, ultimately a lot of this comes down to the Pareto principle, which is the 80-20 rule. So 80% of our problems with time and workload come from 20% of our activities. And in my personal experience, this is true. Like, I spend way more time wasting. If I look at all the things that I do, most of my time and workload come from a very small number of activities that I actually do. So if you can focus on managing those specific activities and issues and try and address those problems, and once one issue is managed well and move on to another, then you're going to be much more effective at managing competing priorities. And so ultimately, hopefully, what this session will help you to figure out is reflect on is, what am I not doing so well, and how do I get better at it? So some of the common barriers that we see to effective priority time management and workload balance include delegation, email, procrastination, micromanagement, meeting management. There's all these different activities that will add these barriers that are either there implicitly or explicitly. And ultimately, we have to decide which ones that we can get better at and which ones ultimately we have to just say, okay, that's not something I can really address because it's fundamental part of who I am, or alternatively, but even if you can get 10% better or 5% better at some of these things, it's going to make life much easier for you. So the first activity I'd like you to do, if you go to your Managing Competing Priorities workbook on page 2, I'd like you to reflect and write these down. So what works well for us or for you in terms of your priority time management? What works well when you're doing well with time management? And what works well when you're managing your workload? What are those activities, tasks, tactics, habits that you get into that work really well? And then what doesn't work so well in terms of priority time management and effective work-life balance? What screws up your day? What screws up all the great plans that you've made? And how do you actually address them from there? So take some time, fill out the personal reflection, and then when you come back to it, we can start listening to the lecture again. So after you've filled out in terms of the personal reflection, then we can talk a little bit more about language. So when we talk about language, we talk about time as though it's a tangible object that we can manage. We find time, we lose time, or make up, or waste, or save, or don't have enough time at all, or we give it to others. Try to find time. We think of time as something that's really tangible, but ultimately is intangible. And as we can see over the last 3 months, time is going to be different for some people. Some people's time is sped up. For me, I have no idea where the last 3 months have gone. For other people, it's slowed down a lot. Ultimately, those speeding up, slowing down, losing time, wasting time, these are all language, and we think we can actually manage it. We talk about, for example, spending time to pay out as money to purchase goods or services and indicate an activity when someone is engaged. What are you actually spending when you spend time? What do we mean by that? What do we mean by that whole notion of engagement, or or even from more of a tangible standpoint in terms of purchasing goods or services? The currency of time, though, is really attention. And this is one of the things from teaching this course that I really think about a lot, is in terms of your attention is perhaps your most precious resource in life. And as someone who's probably always struggled with attention in a lot of different ways and has a family history of people with a bit of attention deficit disorder, either sometimes quite profound, and then other ones were just space cadets, um, is that attention is probably the most precious resource in your life. And the challenge for today and for this session that we're doing is really to focus your attention on how you focus your attention. So you can't really manage time, but you can be more strategic about how you use your attention. So that's really important. So what we're talking about when we're managing competing priorities is, where do you decide to spend attention? Because how productive are you if your attention is fragmented? There's like 20 different things going on and you're spending 30 seconds on each rather than getting them done. If you're thinking about too much in the past, if you're easily distracted, if you're difficult to redirect, if you're focused on worrying about things you can control, all of these, once again, go back to the fact that you're not in the moment and that you're not actually paying attention as a leader to what you're trying to address right now. So it's really important into the strategic allocation of attention to be the master of your schedule, not the victim of it. And you need to develop a skillful relationship with the pace of your own life. Because everybody who's going to be listening to this has a different approach to doing things. And when we look at these books that say this is what you must do, what's going to be right for Tom is not going to be right for Tim. And what's going to be right for Diane is not going to be right for Donna. You have to figure out what works for you, and you accept where you're going to struggle and where you're going to succeed, and figuring out the tactics that are going to help you really thrive in using your attention when you're trying to succeed, and how do you mitigate those distractions in terms of when you're struggling. So the second reflection that I'd like you to do, if you go to your book and take some time to do this, is on personal reflection number 2. So just think, what were you doing yesterday? And if you're reading this on a Saturday or Sunday, or your last working day, but what were you doing yesterday at 10:25? Think about how many meetings did you have in the last 5 days? And then think about, what was your most productive effort in the past couple of weeks? And how are you measuring productivity in this case? And why you were able to be so productive? So when we do our 1 hour Zoom call, we'll be going through your personal reflections, and I'll be asking some people to share what were they doing yesterday, how many meetings that they had, and where were they most productive, etc. So take some time and fill that out, and then come back to the lecture. So after you probably saw the number of meetings that you had and what you were doing and when you were most productive, is that we live in a world of challenges. And those challenges is very much a culture moving to instant response expectations. I carry this phone around. If people don't get back to me within a certain period of time, I think they're angry with me, or I think they're ignoring me, or alternatively, if they probably think the same thing of me. But this notion of instant response, whether instant is defined by 24 hours or 48 hours, it's not defined by weeks. And I find myself apologizing a lot because I get so much email and I don't get to respond right away. Um, is that I say, look, I'm really sorry, drinking through the fire hose, etc. But sometimes, once again, people expect, especially if you're dealing with patients, to get that instant response. Moreover, gadget-enabled 24/7 connectivity. I was listening to an interesting podcast with Adam Grant, who's a professor at Wharton and runs a whole bunch of written a whole bunch of books that are quite influenced the world of organizations and looking at organizations. But he said, increasingly, we expect to have this phone or these computers connected to us 24/7. This is a really, really recent thing. I still, I'm of an age that I remember when you couldn't get people past 5 o'clock in the night unless you called their home. I remember a time when before there was emails. I still remember a buddy of mine back in 1990. I still see him. He was at the university library, and he had a girlfriend at the time at UPEI who was doing veterinary medicine, and they were changing emails back and forth. And I said, and I used to write letters. I really liked writing letters. I was good at writing letters. And I was going, wow, this is great. I don't have to wait a week or two to send somebody a letter. But alas, the world sped up from there to where it wasn't just in libraries, but instead it's connected to us all the time. So that gadget-enabled 24/7 connectivity is something, it is great if you can turn off your phone, which is what I do, from 10 o'clock until 6:15 every morning. Um, but a lot of people can't, and that 24/7 connectivity expectation is there. And organizations are trying to do more with less as well. Ultimately, we live in a world of budgets and budget cuts and of automation. And for the people who are working, we are being expected to do more. At the same time, there's an increasing desire for work-life balance. As I mentioned before, the physicians I knew, especially my dad is in his late 70s now, he would talk about this was being a physician was a lifestyle. It wasn't a 9 to 5 job. And if you got into medicine thinking that it was a 9 to 5 job, you probably made the wrong choice. But also we know that if you work 24/7, you can't do that forever and it's not sustainable. You're not going to have a good relationship with your family. You're not going to be able to sustain your health. You're eventually going to burn out, and we see lots of physician burnout as well. So that need and desire for work-life balance is really important. But what do we mean by work-life balance? Do we look, and this has been in the management literature, this has been an area that's been debated and analyzed and researched, etc. I think more for professions, it's more, instead of saying the word work-life balance, we're looking like for work-life flexibility. Because sometimes you'll be working a lot and sometimes you're going to be working less. How do you get that flexibility with your life? And ultimately, we have too much to do and too many competing priorities. So how do we address those challenges? So the common response, we try to get done by more multitasking. So we try to do 3 or 4 things at once. So we're driving our car, we're on the phone, we're picking up food, we're doing this, etc. Multitasking becomes very popular. We try and work longer hours. And as physicians, you know, everyone thinks, if unless you're working really long hours, you may be not working that hard. Moreover, you take work home, which means that, you finish up your office at 6, 7 o'clock at night, you maybe got 2 or 3 more hours of work. You're responding to digital messages and taking calls at any time and any place. And then for some of you, and for me, this occasionally occurs, you panic in terms of what you're trying to address and all the things that are going on. So when we take a look at multitasking, research suggests we don't really multitask. We shift gears, sometimes rapidly among multiple ongoing events, tasks, or inputs. Shifting gears really means to redirecting attention from one task or idea to another. And shifting gears efficiently is a skill. Like all skills, it can be learned. but it doesn't mean we don't really multitask. All we are is we're doing going from one thing to another. And that shifting gears is really what multitasking is about. But if, as we know, if we're shifting gears all the time, eventually the gears break down. So we also know that focusing on something narrowly with deep concentration is primarily a left brain hemisphere activity for most people. Noticing, responding to new incoming stimulus is primarily a right brain hemisphere activity for most people. So if you're going between left and right in terms of all these incoming stimulus, it's hard. And it's interesting if you look at some of the research around the way that phones and computers, that dopamine that comes into our systems, we need it, or you get addicted to it, and it makes, and so ultimately you get exhausted because you're always looking for that fix. You're always looking for that new email, that new text, that new Twitter like, or that someone calling you because, ultimately that gives you a good positive feeling. But those, that stimulus, eventually you get too stimulated and you just get exhausted. So moving from, once again, from deep concentration to new incoming stimulus on a regular basis primarily means is that you just get exhausted over time. Moreover, performance always suffers. Attention and focus may decline where we merely anticipate the arrival of new digital information. And for anyone who's ever looked at a video lottery, for example, the same premises are being used on our phones and our computers and our life. We anticipate that stimulus that comes in from that new email, from that new Facebook message, from that new Twitter feed. And so some scientists believe that multitasking fatigues the brain, draining it of the ability to focus. But what we get in terms of my experience is decision fatigue. It becomes really difficult for us to make decisions and for us to, as leaders, get things done. So ultimately the question, is there a better way? Is there a better approach to looking at managing competing? So the traditional time management advice we get is to establish clear, measurable goals, plan activities required to meet goals, set priorities and sequences among goals and tasks, get organized, follow your plan, monitor and track your results, and update goals and plans as needed. This is a traditional management approach to pretty much everything in terms of goals, activities, priorities, organization, following plans, monitoring and tracking, and updated goals and plans as needed. I would say of the full spectrum of maybe, if I could think of 100 people off the top of my head, I maybe know two people are really good at this. Um, and probably 98% of the people are not. Some people, if you have this tendency, like high five, I wish I was you. But for most of us, it's really struggle to do this because for lots of different barriers, whether we can't really good at setting goals because we don't use that type 2 thinking that Kahneman and Tversky talked about in their book, in their thinking on behavioral biases. Our ability to plan is compromised by other competing priorities. We really cannot, because of lots of different reasons, set good priorities and sequences. We don't get organized, etc. Also, we have to recognize that you as physicians have an organizational culture that is different than a lot of people in regular leadership or management roles. Your operating values as a profession are going to be different. You have patience, you have the Hippocratic Oath, you have a different value than if you were just in a profit making or in a corporation which had a profit motive. You also have to think of use and effectiveness of meetings. And one of the things that I find when I'm in meetings with physicians is that, and this is one of the reasons that I bring this up is in this course, is that use and effectiveness of meetings is not that great. Sorry. I've never been in a meeting with physicians which I thought could have gone shorter or could have, everything is like what's done in 20 minutes I could do in 5 if I had if I had the control. So meeting management, I think, is a real struggle for physicians because everybody wants to talk, everybody wants their opinion, and because that's how you're taught And that's how you're trained, is to give your opinion, to give your advice. And sometimes in meetings, you just need to learn how to be shorter and more succinct and then move on from there. There's also obviously deadline management. So, what's more important to get things done, or you got a patient calling you. And your performance management and how you're actually rewarded in terms of performance, a lot of times from an organizational culture is going to be different. If you're in the United States, which has for-profit medicine, that's going to be somewhat different than if we're in Canada. Also, in terms of the amount of social interaction that we have from an organizational cultural standpoint as physicians, some nature of some of your practices is that you get lots of social interaction, you get social fatigue, and then other ones you're basically by yourself a lot of the time as well. So ultimately, from an organizational culture standpoint, you're going to be different as physicians, and moreover, depending on your specialty, you may have a different culture, which affects your ability to manage competing priorities as well. Now, social interaction is interesting at work because there can be too much social interaction at work. I have a colleague, and you may call at some point, and he's great. I really like him, but if I see him in the office, I lose an hour because he'll talk to me at least 3 times for 15 minutes. There's a call, but I don't think that's him. Um, there can also be too little social interaction. And in terms of too little social interaction, is that you're by yourself all the time and you're not speaking to people. And that's one of the things in the pandemic, we're getting lots of healthcare tips around mental awareness and mental health, etc. Some of that comes is that for people who are very, very socially interactive, they're not getting that anymore. And repeated studies have shown that the right amounts of social interaction work uh, boost productivity. The question is how much is too much and how much is too little, and a lot of that's going to depend on the organizational culture, but it's also going to relate to your personal tendencies as well. So the next task I'd like you to do is to look at your own organizational culture. And fill in pages 4 and 5 and critically reflect on how your organizational culture within the healthcare setting that you work, how does that help you manage competing priorities? This task is a little bit longer. It should take about 10, 15 minutes to complete. Take your time and then come back to the lecture. Another factor beyond the organizational culture is your current workload. What are your day-to-day responsibilities? My life was much simpler when I didn't have children. As I like to tell my wife, I got up in the morning, I went and exercised, and I worked. Maybe had some drinks with friends, maybe played some rugby, maybe went back to the gym, maybe went for a walk, or maybe just went home and watched TV. And then I got up the next day and I went to work. Now my wife has a job, which means that she cannot leave her work in the middle of the day to pick up the kids, so I have responsibilities there. I sit on a bunch of boards, which take up a lot of responsibility. I do consulting, which takes up responsibility. I teach. I have a bunch of graduate students, which take up responsibility, etc. So my day-to-day responsibilities from the age of 30 from 30 to 40 to 50 have gone up incredibly. And that current workload, means that I need to get better at managing competing priorities. There's also things that show up in terms of special assignments and projects, as well as high priority interruptions. So sometimes I get a call and I got to stop things and go ahead and address that call, whether it's my children or if it's a project I'm working on, or or my dean contacts me, etc. There's also regular meetings that I have to attend, and I'm sure once again for you guys the same thing is in place. Those day-to-day responsibilities, those special assignments, projects, those high priority interruptions, and those regular meetings, and other things that you may be at that I hadn't really thought about, but they mean that life in terms of managing competing priorities is really difficult. You also have personal tendencies, so hours of work. And it's interesting. I think we've changed in Western society somewhat in that there used to be a time where you had to be at work early in the morning and then leave at a certain time. And people work in different ways. Right, and it took me a while. I was probably in my 40s before I really started to really appreciate this. But if I'm out for a walk and I'm thinking through an academic paper that I'm writing, Or if I'm chatting with somebody and we're talking about something related to work, then the way I see it, I'm working. Now, other people may say, no, you have to be at your desk to be working. But I think, and I know for me, my hours of work, they not don't matter as much in terms of what I actually get done. And that's going to be reflected in terms of my energy level. My energy level, as I mentioned before, is great in the morning, not so good in the afternoon, and it's pretty good in the evening. So how do I find that optimal energy level? The optimal physical environment has been something that's challenged, obviously, with the pandemic. I'm at my home office now, and I'll probably be here until Christmas. You may hear my kids in the background arguing with each other, home calls going through, etc. This is not the optimal place to be focused and attentive and all that sort of thing. It's gotten better. Bought an elliptical trainer just right before the pandemic so I can make sure I could work out. I go for walks in the day. So ultimately, but it's not my office. It's not a place where I'm just here for work. I've tried, but that's not going to be the same for everybody else. Now, if you're like any other physician leadership program I've taught on, lunch, snacks, and short breaks are not something you guys do very often. And you probably, so what is lunch? Um, the research shows, though, if you're taking those lunch, snacks, and short breaks, you're way more productive than someone who isn't. And by productive, you're way more better at managing competing priorities. I'm sorry to tell you this. So for eating lunch at your office desk for 3 minutes and then going to another meeting is not ideal. I'm not saying you take a leisurely 2 hour lunch with a nice bottle of Merlot, but what I'm saying is that the research shows, once again, that lunch, snacks, and short breaks makes it easier for us to manage competing priorities. But obviously, that's a personal tendency. Some people are really good in terms of tracking their progress and putting down journals and talking about what they do on a regular basis. And this is one of the things when I started teaching this course, my life has been better when I started writing stuff down. But not everybody's like that. Um, I personally didn't mind tracking every hour of my day when I was a management consultant. I found it quite soothing in a number of ways. But other people are not like that. And some people have comfort and ease with shifting gears, and other people are not. I have some colleagues who really, really struggle when they have to move from teaching to research to offices or to meetings and all those sort of things. So really up to you in terms of how you kind of address it or don't address it, etc. So your personal tendencies are going to become really important. There's also your basic mental activities in terms of your ability to understand new information, making decisions, recalling existing information, memorizing or inhibiting thoughts or ideas. Those basic mental activities, which we all have, once again, are going to be influenced by your organizational culture, by your personal tendencies, by your workload, by all the things that are going on. But those basic mental activities that we expected take time and they take attention and they take energy. So ultimately, we have to be, if we're managing competing priorities, we have to think about how we do all those sort of things as well. So the next exercise in terms of what's your current workload, I'd like you to look at page 6 on the Managing Competing Priorities workbook and fill that out. What is your current workload? Talk about the number of meetings. What are the things that you're doing? What are all the different activities you're going on? This is help you to reflect on terms of you're probably not every thought through on a regular basis what you're currently doing in terms of all the things going on. So take your time, fill out the exercise, and then come back to the lecture. So we've identified up front some of the barriers to managing competing priorities. And one of those is procrastination, which is something, unfortunately, in my life, I'm pretty good at getting a lot of stuff done, but there's certain things that I procrastinate on. And one of my favorite authors, Nicholas Nassim Taleb, talked about procrastination being, realistically, your subconscious is telling you this is really stupid what you should be doing, and so you stop doing it. But it seems that no one is really immune to the tendency to procrastinate. When someone asked Ernest Hemingway how to write a novel, his response was, first you defrost the refrigerator. But putting off tasks takes a big hit on our productivity and psyche as well. So delaying work is often a symptom of how busy you are, but procrastination is not inevitable. Figuring out why you postpone work and then taking concrete steps to prevent it will help you to get more done and feel good about yourself. And of course, we don't want to dodge things we don't like, but many people procrastinate because they fear the drudgery of the difficulty of the task they're avoiding. Putting it off doesn't make it go away. Getting it done does. Let me say that again. Putting it off doesn't make it go away. Getting it done does. And not everyone's a procrastinator. So for you, if you're not a procrastinator, then just keep on skipping through these slides and you can get to the next session. But a lot of us are. So when you find yourself ignoring or delaying a task, ask yourself why. There are two types of tasks most often deferred. Something you don't like to do, which is a lot of times the case for me, and something you don't know how to do. Once you've identified why you're putting something off, you can address it and prevent future bouts of procrastination. So part of that is creating a clear schedule with due dates for each part of the task. And as soon as you get the project, or as soon as you get what you need to do, chunk it down into a few manageable segments that you can complete in a sequence. Then assign deadlines for each piece. For example, put an appointment in your calendar to work on a small piece in the next segment each day to allow yourself to get it done in a bit of a time. One of the things that I would do is that I said, I'm going to give myself 2 hours to get work on a project. Once that's done, and then I'm going to move on to something else. And I'm going to work on that 2 hours a day until the project's finished. If I'd worked on it 10 hours, I would never have gotten it done. But a couple hours each day, then I get it done. So small wins make the work much more manageable and contribute to a sense of progress, and achieving them is much easier than trying to barrel through a complex project as well. So setting deadlines also makes sure the project doesn't get buried. And for things you're likely to put off, add reminders in your calendar or put a post-it note on your computer screen. Use whatever visual clues to ensure you don't avoid what's there. So one of the ways of addressing procrastination is to increase the rewards. We often procrastinate because the reward for doing a certain assignment is too far off. To make a task feel more immediate, focus on short-term rewards. Such as, if I give this done, I'm going to go for a walk, or I'm going to go buy a latte, or I'll go call a friend, or I'll send a bunch of emails. Or if there's any, and so that's ultimately, if you also embed the reward into the task itself, it makes it easier to do. The other thing is never worry alone. And that's one of the things that it's really helped me with my procrastination, is I talk to people about it. If you don't know how to do something, ask for help. Turn to a trusted colleague or friend for advice, or look for an example project you're working on to kind of, once again, to beg, borrow, steal to get the project moving, etc. Other people are a great source of extrinsic motivation. Tom, let's get this done so that we can go to the movies, or we can go for a drink, or we can go do something fun. And they ultimately can help you push things and get it done from there. But addressing procrastination is really a habit. You have control over whether you procrastinate or not, and you'll be very proud when you change it. There are also immediate benefits when you start getting things done right away, and it's a habit you can cultivate. Track your improvement. Make progress in meaningful words and activities and all the things, like celebrate it. I know friends of mine, I wouldn't do this, but they put it on Facebook when they say, hey, I got this done, I got that done, etc. And they make me feel bad. But that's how they do it. They reward themselves by showing everyone how good they are. So in terms of procrastination principles, do identify which tasks you're mostly likely to put off. Do use deadlines to motivate you to get things done within a certain time frame, and do reward yourself for reaching those milestones. On the other hand, don't call yourself a procrastinator as if it's a intrinsic part of who you are. You can change. Don't tackle arduous tasks on your own. Ask others to help you get over the hump. And don't try to finish a project in one sitting. Break it down into meaningful, achievable chunks. So some of the ways in terms of to get over this procrastination, and this applies for all managing competing priorities, is to basically set the techniques, or set the priorities. So one of those things is called an ABC analysis. Something is, if it's A, it's important and urgent, B, it's important or not urgent, or C, it's neither. Figure out what you have to do. Is it important and urgent? B, important, not urgent, or C, neither. An Eisenhower method, which we'll get to later on, is kind of an expanded ABC. And the Pareto principle, which is effectively the 80-20 rule, which we addressed earlier on in the lecture. The question, though, around assessing important urgency really depends, once again, on the organization that you're working for, your current workload, your current role, your leadership position, etc. So some of the questions you have to ask is the task you're being done, or task you're trying to address, or the priority you're trying to address is aligned with the stated mission and goals? Are there other actions dependent on its completion? What are the consequences of delaying its completion by a day, a week? Who has decision authority to delay it, and what will be delayed if it takes precedent? Who will be affected in either way? Those kind of questions really help you assess importance and urgency and figure out what are the most important things you got to do and spend your time on, and what are the other things that you can just, once again, park and work on at another time. So the Eisenhower method is basically figuring out if something is important or less important or urgent and not important, or not urgent. If something is important and urgent, you got to get it done. On the other hand, if it's something less important and urgent, figure out how to delegate it. If something is not urgent and is important, you can decide whether to do it, delegate it, or dump it. If something is not important, or is less important and is not urgent, then dump it. Don't do it. Find somebody else to do it, or just don't do it at all. And ultimately, you have to figure out, can you share the load? Can you delegate any task? Can someone help you with some assignments even temporarily? And do you have the option of saying no to new assignments? This has been one of the things that I continually, personally, in terms of managing competing priorities, my ability to delegate. I don't have anyone to delegate to as a professor. I guess I got some teaching assistants I can delegate some teaching to. But ultimately, I'm getting to the point now in my 50s where I got to get better at delegation or I'm just going to get burnt out. And that's going to cost me some money, but I think I'm okay with that. I tried last year, about 18 months ago, I tried to hire a personal assistant, didn't really work out. I got to try and find somebody new because there's too many things going on in my life. What I do, though, have done is I do try and say no to new assignments. And someone really has to pull favors, or I have to know them personally for me to say yes to something now. Um, because I know just on my worst enemy, I'll come up with ideas saying, hey, we should try and do this and do that. And then my boss will say, sure, go ahead, Tom. And I'll go, oh, damn, what have I done? But ultimately asking that question, can you delegate any tasks? Can someone help you with assignments? And do you have the option of saying no to new assignments is really, really important. So the next exercise I'd like you to do is to look at your personal tendencies at work and the details of your daily routine. So if you go to Managing Competing Priorities workbook, page 7, you can write down what you believe your personal tendencies at work and work out the details of your daily routine. That reflection critique can really, really help you trying to address what you're trying to do. We're about 50 minutes in now in terms of me speaking. So given the size, and we're about halfway through the slide pack, so this will be the end of part 1 of the Managing Competing Priorities Physician Leadership Program. There'll be a part 2 where we'll just be following up, but I'm basically dividing both into 2 parts just for file size. Okay, so please find part 2, which will get you through the rest of the exercises as well as the rest of the content in terms of managing competing priorities. Thank you for everyone for your engagement. Make sure you finish off exercise 5 before you go to the rest of the material.